on.
Okay. Well, Philip, we're
ready to go. Well, welcome to the Thursday edition of E-Rotary Coastal Club. Today we are very excited to announce that we have our charter membership application. It's going to be ready to go in today. And hopefully within the next few weeks, we'll actually have an officially chartered club. We've been running since mid-February as a startup and have had some tremendous participation with some phenomenal speakers and great participation from our E-Rotary Club members. And today we will continue that fine tradition. And so let's go ahead and get started with the Rotary particulars. All Rotary clubs in the United States typically begin with a prayer and the pledge. We'll go ahead and just start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and you can, however you'd like to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to yourself or out loud. I'm going to do it out loud. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. A hallmark of the Rotary International is the four-way test. This was developed very early in the Rotary's history, and it really describes who we are as individuals who collaborate together to serve our local communities as well as our global communities. It's of the things we think, say, or do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? That's the four-way test, and that's how we want to let everyone know as Rotarians what our desire is to deal in truth and in beneficial service activities to our communities. And in speaking about the beneficial service activities to our communities, one of the things that we are doing as a club is we're accumulating currently names of companies and organizations and nonprofits who are involved in coastal issues, whether that be in Louisiana or anywhere in the United States or globally. And we're going to provide a register, in essence, on our website that will include a link to those organizations as well as a brief bio on what those organizations provide. Our hope is that we can be a reservoir of information for people who either local landowners or businesses who have a question about something that's happening in their local community. They can go to this reservoir and find out the particular agencies or organizations that provide services of what they need. And if there's something where there could be some collaboration, cooperation between organizations, again, this will be a resource for them to use to again, cooperate and collaborate. Let me introduce today's guest, because this is something that really goes along with that idea of collaboration and cooperation. We have Matthew Sanders with us today. Matthew is the Resilience Program and Policy Administrator for the state of Louisiana's Office of Community Development. The state has received a $92.6 million award in conjunction with the HUD-funded National Disaster Resilience Competition, it's an NDRC, including a $40 million award to support its resilience policy framework, Louisiana's Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments. That's where the LASAFE acronym comes from. And a $48.3 million award to resettle the Isle de Jean Charles community in Terrebonne Parish. Matthew was the state's project team lead for NDRC application and currently leads the development of the two awarded projects. And so, Matthew, I'm going to turn it over to you to let us know what the LASAFE program is about and what it is that they have you doing.
Sure, thank you. And first of all, I would just like to thank everybody for their participation and for the invitation to address everybody today. This sounds like a really amazing club you all are putting together, and one which I would like to join myself. So that's all pretty neat. LASAFE is a program that the governor launched in March. And it's a collaboration between my organization, the state's Office of Community Development, and the Foundation for Louisiana. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a few minutes. But I guess just to add a little context as to how my office got involved working in the coastal space to begin with. So we maintain a disaster recovery portfolio. We're responsible for long-term disaster recovery in the state of Louisiana. We have a $16 billion portfolio of community development block grant funds that ultimately emanate from HUD. And so that $16 billion portfolio covers Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, the March and August flooding events of last year. And through all of our recovery activities, we've really become acutely aware of this symbiotic relationship, if you will, this toxic and symbiotic relationship between our coastal conditions, the land loss, subsidence, sea level rise issues that we're facing, and our propensity to incur large-scale flood damages, right? And so as we've worked in these coastal environments in their rebuilding activities over the past 12 years, we've really come to know a lot of the communities and a lot of the stakeholder groups that are acutely impacted by the events that are taking place and over a longer period of time through this ongoing environmental degradation. And so as we ended up leading the state's effort to respond to the National Disaster Resilience Competition, we obviously have a very strong partnership with CPRA and with many other state organizations. But we really, from a planning perspective and from a relationship perspective, have already established a foothold on the ground. So I guess to introduce this program, it's really predicated on what is a really alarming set of ideas that comes through the 2017 version of the Coastal Master Plan. And it's really around this general notion that we understand, and I'll illustrate this visually here later on in the presentation, that regardless of what we do through the Coastal Master Plan on the structural protection side and through coastal restoration, at least as we can model it out over the next 50 years, we understand that we're going to lose more land than we can legitimately rebuild, and as a result, we're going to incur a higher degree of flood risk in many of our coastal communities. And so it kind of shifts the focus at that point from saying, okay, if we're unequivocal in our support, and the governor has been emphatic on this point, if we're going to support coastal restoration and structural protection activities to the extent to which we can, but we know that that through the implementation of those activities, we can't fully realize a full restoration of our coast, and we're not going to be able to protect everybody. We really got to start thinking through what it means to live on a smaller footprint in the state of Louisiana. And so that's where we start talking about adaptation. It's this idea that we're already seeing population and economic movements take place as a result of acute disaster events and those long-term environmental conditions that we're all familiar with. But how do we think through how those population shifts and economic changes continue to occur over a longer period of time, and how do we think through planning and investment activities in accordance with what we can reasonably anticipate. And so I guess to just kind of introduce that concept, I'll go into, and my slides aren't moving for some reason. Okay, there we go. So LASAFE is all about adaptation, and we predicated around this general mission that we're working together for community resilience, economic prosperity, and a better quality of life for everyone in Louisiana. So I mentioned the $16 billion disaster recovery portfolio that we maintain. That covers disaster events that have led to a major disaster declaration in every parish in the state of Louisiana. And so I know when we talk about flooding events specifically in the Coastal Master Plan, we're typically talking about the coastal zone area specifically, but we understand this is a flood-prone state, right? And if we're thinking through future development patterns and how we mitigate flood loss over time, it's really a 64-parish issue. Even if we think about it from the coastal perspective, however, we do understand that as those population movements take place and as those economic movements take place, that impacts everybody, right? And so the example that I typically defer to is the large population shift we saw immediately after Hurricane Katrina from St. Tammany Parish to St. Bernard Parish, right? And so that created this situation that ultimately has been detrimental to both places, in that now St. Bernard has infrastructure and development build out to accommodate a population and, more importantly, a tax base that's no longer there, while St. Tammany saw a population boom it wasn't really expecting in a very, very short period of time, and it's been struggling to catch up to build out that infrastructure to accommodate that population. So we're trying to avoid those types of drastic shocks and stressors that we've seen in that type of post-disaster environment. And I think we can really only do that if we're thinking through what the landscape is going to look like into the future. And so as we talk about these issues, it's not really just coastal, but it's a total state issue, and we need to start thinking of it that way. This award that we got from HUD, the $92.6 million, is localized to a 6-parish initial target area, that being St. Tammany, Jefferson, Plaquemine, St. John the Baptist, Lafourche, and Terrebonne. That's not random, and it's also not necessarily by choice. And so those were the parishes that were most impacted by Hurricane Isaac in 2012, and that stems back to the funding source and how we have to justify the expenditure of these dollars as a disaster recovery matter to our friends at HUD. If I had had my druthers, I would have included a few other parishes, notably St. Charles and St. Bernard. I think if we're talking about it regionally, that would have made a lot of sense. But unfortunately, this is the regulatory apparatus that we're working with, and so we're starting off in these 6 parishes. Now, I think as was previously mentioned, this was a $92.6 million award. About $40 million is specific to this project, LASAFE, and another $48.3 million is specific to the resettlement of Ville-de-Jean-Charles in remote southeastern Terrebonne Parish. But those are really part and parcel of the same thing, because when we talk about this policy framework, when we talk about LASAFE, we're really talking about this general idea that we're looking at 3 basic types of conditions at the community scale as we think through coastal challenges down the road. And the first scenario is the unfortunate scenario in which we think through contraction, right? You have a community, it's either not going to exist in its current location and in its current form relative to some of the environmental changes we can expect, or if it does exist, it can expect to exist on a drastically smaller footprint with a potentially smaller population and a potentially smaller economy. So that's obviously the most dire and acute situation we could think through. But additionally, along the coast, I'm sure I don't have to explain to the people that are on this call that we have a working coast, right? We have economic assets, we have cultural assets, and so we can initiate a full-scale retreat from our coast, but we do need to think through what the appropriate community development footprint, what the appropriate size of those respective communities needs to be, reflective of flood risk and reflective of those assets that occur along the coast. And so if we think through this contraction scenario, we also think through this fortification scenario where we're essentially mapping out assets and we're trying to figure out who are the people that need to be in this place to appropriately service those assets. So with that said, the third condition that we talk about is a little more optimistic, and it's if we've got this great modeling data through CPRA and all the work they do in conjunction with the Coastal Master Plan, we can identify those areas that we reasonably believe are going to be high and dry into the future. And if we can identify those areas, and if we understand that they're not currently achieving the highest and best use of those geographies, how do we incentivize economic development? How do we prepare those areas to absorb population down the line? And so that's really the crux of a lot of what we're doing through this program as of today. So we're in the middle of what is a year-long planning process, and we, like I said, the governor kicked this off with a speech in March. We had an initial set of what we're calling parish-wide public meetings, and what we mean by that is meeting at the parish scale. So we had one meeting in usually the largest location in each of our 6 parishes last week of March, first week of April. And the point of that initial outreach was to essentially introduce the idea, right, to say that the Coastal Master Plan is something that we're fully committed to. We're fully committed to structural protection. We're fully committed to coastal restoration. But those offer some limited sets of outcomes, right? And so if we're going to incur land loss and a higher degree of flood risk, irrespective of what we do through those 2 types of implementations, then we also need to think through population and economic movements. So having introduced that idea, and I'll go through what we did in those meetings here later in the presentation, we also decided that we needed to have smaller community meetings, and that's what we're doing now, in some of those linchpin communities within each of our target parishes. And so last week and this week, In fact, tonight will be our last set of meetings, but we had 21 individual community meetings in total, in which we really wanted to go see people where they live, where they work, where they play, understand those environments, understand their needs, not only today, but in the future, and begin working toward developing out a common vision for these communities that in some way, shape, or form will be impacted by our changing environment. And so we're going to continue to juxtapose it in this fashion in about two months. So end of July, early August, we'll go back to the parish scale, and then we'll go back to the community scale 2 months after that. And then finally, one more time at the parish scale, we'll have a draft plan. And the purpose of that is really to continually gather data, analyze it, try to understand what we think it means, and then continually go back to the public and really ask them to validate or reject our working hypotheses that we're developing based on our conversations with them. So that's what we're going to be doing over the course of the 2017 calendar year. So as we talk about the $40 million for this process specifically, we'll spend a little bit of money this year on this planning process, but then as we move into 2018, we'll make investments in demonstration projects in each of our 6 parishes that ultimately are proposed through these parish strategies. So it's important that we, as we go through any planning process, there's been a lot of planning work in these areas and really across the state, specifically after Katrina. We got to make sure we understand the work that's already been done, the local understanding of the coastal challenge in that environment, not only today but into the future. And we need to make sure we build upon that, but also combine it with this best scientific data that we have at our disposal through CPRA and the Coastal Master Plan. And so that's what we're doing here is part organizational, right, to gather all the information that currently exists and then try to add a value-added component based on how we interact with local communities and how we add our own expertise as planners and thought leaders in this space. And so, it's really about planning for the bigger picture, right? If we understand communities to be multifaceted and to have a number of different individual characteristics, how do we think about how those communities change over time relative to the environmental changes that we can reasonably expect? And we're doing this through a process that we call co-design. And by co-design, we're really talking about a set of principles or a pact, if you will, that we're making with those local communities as we conduct outreach, as we go through this planning process, as we talk through the environmental future that we can project. And it's really to share power, to prioritize relationships, include all points of view, use all kinds of knowledge. This is a big one, right? I think, for all of the science and the know-how and engineering and everything that we can all bring to the table, in a lot of cases, there's really just no substitute for getting in a boat with somebody who's, worked on waterways their entire lives and can tell you how those waterways have changed as they've seen it through their own eyes over a period of time. And so the extent to which we can gather and synthesize local knowledge bases is really crucial to how whether or not we'll be successful on this project. And then finally, as I alluded to in kind of going through our schedule, we really want to test solutions early and often. And so, as we're continually gathering data, as we're continually learning more, and we're continually thinking through a vision for our coastal communities and those that may receive populations as a result of those communities contracting, it's all about trying to form a vision and continually presenting that vision back to the people that, are ultimately going to live, hopefully to see it, and ask them if it reflects their values and their goals and their understanding of what the future is going to entail. And so we're trying to create what is essentially a feedback loop through engagement, analysis, research, and outreach. And so again, it's gathering information, kind of taking it back in the proverbial laboratory, analyzing it, trying to understand what it means, trying to develop out a plan with all of the expertise and capacity we have at our disposal at the state and with our partners, and then continually going back and having that conversation with local communities to again, either validate or reject what we think reflects their values and what we know about the future. If we're successful in this process, like I said, we'll end up with 6 adaptation strategies across our target parish region at the end of this calendar year, with the idea that hopefully this will collectively reflect a regional approach to those population and economic movements and how we think about community development build out reflective of future flood risk and future land loss. So the state has attempted, and I think this is really where this project aligns most closely with the E-Rotary Coastal organization, in that, we really understand that there are a lot of NGO groups, there are a lot of professional organizations, there are a lot of entities of state government that are all broadly working on this coastal challenge, right? And so we've really attempted to bring together as robust a group as possible to help us think through the challenges and think through, from a community perspective, what those challenges mean and entail. And so, this is not a perfect effort. There are obviously a lot of people that are working in this space that are not reflective within our project or on this slide. But I think, like the club that we're convened within today, the idea is to really try to get everybody to a common table and try to push in a common direction, so we're not duplicating efforts, and we can think through how we ultimately solve this problem with a degree of efficiency that maybe we haven't had in the past. So I guess to kind of highlight the problem that we're trying to solve and the method by which we communicate the problem to our constituent communities, we start talking about, I don't know why my slides keep going ahead of me, but we start by talking about elevation. And so we understand that our highest and ostensibly driest ground is going to be essentially either along the riverbank as it runs today or where the river once flowed, right? So we understand how sediment deposits have built up land over time. And so if we're trying to seek out those higher elevation locales within which we would build out future population growth and future economic growth, we really think we need to localize in those areas that are of highest elevation. And that I think is intuitive and I hope would make sense to everybody. But we've also seen that population shifts have already taken place, more or less, along those same lines, right? And so we've seen populations retreat from our coastline, and we've seen populations grow within those areas that at least have a perception of being higher and drier locales. And so if we look at it through this perspective, we see population shifts that are already taking place. But just to kind of bring home the idea that economic shifts take place in concert with these population movements, in each of these low-lying communities that have lost population, we've also unfortunately seen a decline in household incomes. And so I think we can infer from that information that in many cases, those people that have the economic means and the flexibility to do so are choosing to move, and those that don't have the same type of flexibility are unfortunately left behind in our highly vulnerable environments. And so as we think through not only the population movements and the economic shifts that are currently taking place, we also have to think through the social challenges that come with communities that very rapidly are declining in wealth. And that's kind of where the resettlement project comes in. I don't know how many of you have been to Ile-de-Jean-Charles specifically, but it is a community that is mired in deep poverty. And so, picking up a community that is low income and trying to move it somewhere that is going to be higher, drier, and safer for the long run, you got to think through the economics of how do we ultimately incentivize job development, how do we ultimately incentivize an economy that is far greater than the one that currently exists on the island. So it's really trying to think through multiple problems, both from an environmental perspective, a social perspective, and an economic perspective simultaneously. So the way that we've talked about LASAFE specifically, we think about this as a 100-year project, right? And so we always look back 50 years before we look forward 50 years. And we do this for two reasons. One, I think it helps illustrate to the people that live in our most vulnerable communities how changes have taken place over time. But it also helps us if we understand how environments have changed over time, and we understand some of those social and economic trends that have changed as a result of those environmental changes. Then we can reasonably think through how we might see similar changes manifest themselves as we project out environmental changes to come. And so we always start with this idea of the 1960 map, and we talk about this well-defined shape that is the boot. But then, as I think you all have probably seen, as we move forward to today, it's a far more skeletal view of what the state of Louisiana looks like. And so, this kind of helps us as a visual aid because, there are some folks that simply have a hard time believing some of the more dire scenarios that we may face in the future relative to land loss and sea level rise and subsidence and all these things that contribute to an added flood risk. But it's really hard to argue with the map, right? And so if we understand what the map looked like 50 years ago and we understand what it looks like today, and we can see with our own eyes that very drastic change in landform, that's a difficult thing to argue around. We also show occasionally, although I'm somewhat loath to show this scenario, the 2067 future with no action. But, this is what it can be if we don't maintain that commitment to coastal restoration and structural protection that I alluded to earlier in the presentation. Obviously, we're not going to do nothing, and so, it's important that we think through what the scenario looks like with implementation of the Coastal Master Plan, and we can obviously see, demonstrable gains through restoration activities and through structural protections. But the point that we really try to drive home is the idea that even under this positive scenario in which we're fully implementing the Coastal Master Plan and we can see the gains that we can reasonably anticipate therein, we can see that it ends up with a landform that is significantly less than the one that we live with today. And I don't think anybody would reasonably argue that we're well protected or invulnerable to severe flooding events as we exist today. And so if you think through what it's going to look like 50 years from now, you can understand the incline in risk. So just to further drive that point home, we also talk about anticipated flood risk as of today relative to what we would see in the future. And so the deepest blues that you see on this particular projection are those areas that would be potentially most impacted by a severe flooding event. Again, if we don't do anything, you see a lot more very deep blue on this map. We're not going to do nothing. We can see the benefits of the Coastal Master Plan. But relative to today, obviously this map gets a lot more dark in color, and therefore we can anticipate reasonably a higher degree of flood risk. So we always try to drive home this point that adaptation needs to be the third leg of this proverbial stool, along with structural protection and restoration. And we're always emphasizing that through the Coastal Master Plan and through the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, we're going to do everything we can as a state to protect as many people as possible and to restore as much land as possible. But there are a few realities that we really need to start talking about as a state. And so one is obviously funding, right? And so if the plan is fully funded, we understand that the risk will still increase. But I'm sure most of you on this call understand the plan is not fully funded. And when there's talk in Washington, for example, of Go Mesa being repealed and our having one less funding source than what we had expected to fund the $50 billion plan, that ends up amounting to a significant challenge for how we think through whether or not that plan ultimately is fully implemented and how we think through population movements, economic changes, and community development patterns as a result. So we don't try to really scare people en masse relative to this funding consideration, but I don't think anybody would argue that Louisiana is an especially wealthy state. And so, if we think through the challenges as we move forward, funding is certainly one. And I don't know that it would be wise for us to simply suggest that the $50 billion is going to manifest itself in any total way. So the Coastal Master Plan does focus on many of the physical challenges, as you all know, $25 billion for restoration, 18.8 for structural protection. But then there's this $6 billion piece that is for the non-structural program, or as we would talk about it, adaptation. And so that's really what we're trying to figure out how to program out from a more holistic perspective, mindful of the idea that the non-structural program, as it's currently constituted, really talks about three different types of conditions. So there's that low risk in which CPRA would provide opportunities for businesses to flood-proof. There's that medium risk environment in which homeowners would be offered elevation opportunities, and then there's the high risk where homeowners would be offered voluntary acquisitions. Those three types of programs have to be part of any adaptation strategy. I think that's fairly obvious for us and for everybody else. But one of the things that we're talking about is the idea that we have an opportunity to really think through this in a bigger, more holistic way. And so protecting homes and businesses are great, but that's not really a reflection of what a community is. And so if we understand that communities have social components, we understand that communities are impacted by the environment, we understand that as the environment changes, economies change, and obviously demographics change. If we understand all of those things simultaneously and how they operate in concert with the environmental changes that we can expect, then we can begin to think through future community development patterns, future population movements, future economic movements, and if we can identify those things, then perhaps we can find some opportunity as well to take advantage of. And so if we think through adaptation, we think through what we're doing aside from structural protection and aside from restoration, we really need to think through those types of programs in a way that I think are a little more encompassing than simply floodproofing, buyouts, and elevation programs. So we're really trying to tap into creativity, and we're really trying to think through in a comprehensive way. If we essentially have 50 years before, or at least in the modeling that we show, before we see that more dire scenario, then it's really a two-generation thought process. So when we went out at the parish scale on the first go-round, we visited each of our 6 parishes, and we introduced this general idea of the third leg of that proverbial stool. We ended up having 505 residents visit us across the 6-parish region, and as I'll drill down on in a moment, we were ultimately able to develop out more than 2,000 individual ideas around this idea of if we're going to incur a higher degree of flood risk, if we're going to lose more land than we can build, what are those community assets that we really need to protect or move? So we asked residents about values and goals. It was essentially an attempt to begin a relationship, right? And so if we're going to try to plan out and vision for the future in a local environment, we've got to understand the local environment, and we've got to bring in the knowledge and the thought processes that are inherent with those communities themselves. And so we were able to gather a lot of data. Folks described a lot of the strengths and the opportunities within their own communities, along with the things that they're afraid of over time as we can project environmental changes. And we ultimately were able to take all of those ideas and synthesize them in a number of different categories that ultimately have formed the basis of a second set of meetings that we're currently in the middle of. And so we did this across the 6-parish region. We had this plethora of ideas and thoughts that we were able to put into some organized form. And we ultimately put those into 9 different topics that you see here. And they're under the general umbrella of community and culture, environment and sustainability, and economy and jobs. And so as we have gone back out over the past couple of weeks to further engage with those communities that we visited, these are the types of conversations we really want to have. And what we've asked our community participants to do is to think through these 9 topics individually and think through, in light of the environmental changes, what is going to happen in their community and what they would like to see happen in their communities at a 10-year benchmark, a 25-year benchmark, and a 50-year benchmark. One of the other things that we asked in our first round of meetings is where we should meet next. And so as I talked about this alternating scale of going from the macro level at the parish level to a micro level within individual communities, we just asked the question on the first go-round. We said, look, what are the linchpin communities within this parish, and where should we go next to see people where they live, work, and play? And we ultimately were able to develop 18 different locations across our 6-parish region. We've had 21 individual community meetings that will end up tonight. The additional 3 were specifically targeted to Vietnamese and Cambodian populations, which I'll note have been extremely active in this planning process up to date. We've had more than 200 people from those communities specifically come out and provide us a lot of really good feedback and information. So that's what we're doing now. And as we've gone out to really drill down on these individual communities, we presented them with a drilled down version of how we can articulate risk in the future. And so we've got what is something of a fairly complicated map here. And it's meant to illustrate that as we drill down in a particular community, in a particular environment, where do we really want to coalesce future development? And there are a lot of elements that come with that, including an articulation of future flood risk, right? So if you see these very deep blue colors, that's where we would expect 50 years from now to be prone to a 12-foot or greater 100-year flood event. But also we're able to articulate where we would expect to see land losses, where we would expect to see wetlands develop, but also, and perhaps most importantly, how we can anticipate elevation over time. And so what we really want people to think through, if we're thinking through in a place like Belchase, population growth, economic growth, how do we coalesce our future development patterns, and how do we do so on our highest ground territory? And so, we're trying to, I don't want to say push, but perhaps suggest or nudge that communities think through their future development on their high ground ridges. And so this is why we try to illustrate elevation in concert with future flood risk, in concert with future land losses. So just to illustrate how we've done this in several different communities, I pulled out Plaquemine just for illustrative purposes here today. I'll actually be in Buras later this afternoon conducting a community meeting using a lot of these materials. And so in Plaquemine are the three communities that we've localized have been in Belchase, in the Phoenix and Davan area, and then, as I said, in Buras. And so, if we're looking at a projection like this one in I guess the middle area of Plaquemine Parish, if you will, you really begin to understand that that there are limited development opportunities, there are limited places that are going to be somewhat protected by significant flood events, and many of those places are going to be localized along the riverbank. Again, if we go further south, we understand that there will obviously be few and far between opportunities to build out areas like Empire, Buras, Triumph, and Venice. And so if we can get those communities to think through that smaller development space and how they begin to adapt to it over time, that's really where we're trying to go to establish a plan and a vision for how we move forward as a community over 10, 25, and 50 years. So this culminates in this fairly complicated table sheet that we work from, and I'll be working from tonight. And so we're trying to show several different things through this type of articulation. It's that drilled down approach to show where there may be future development opportunity and where we should probably try to concentrate future growth. But it's also this understanding that as a parish, we've seen significant changes over time. So again, using that 100-year perspective, 1967 to 2067, we're illustrating those changes in landform and how we would reasonably anticipate flood risk increasing over time. But we also add this point about generations, right? And so if we're talking about 100 years, it's essentially, you're talking about several different generations that are impacted, from the lost generation to generations that we haven't named yet, out to 2067. And that's really reflective of the idea that, you yourself may only care about a 10-year vision into the future or a 25-year vision into the future. But if you start thinking through what the communities are going to be like for your kids or your grandkids or your great-grandkids, it adds a different level of context. And so that's really how we ask people to think through the future, not just for themselves, but for generations that will inherit our environments from us. And we try to do so in such a way that we're attempting to illustrate this connection between changes in environmental landform, changes in a projection of flood risk, in concert with economic changes and population changes as a result. So with that said, I'll go ahead and wrap up my remarks, and I'll be happy to take any questions that any of you may have.
All right, I'll ask a question. This is Philip. Every time we have a presentation, I'm just blown away by what's out there. I had two questions that came to mind. You answered one of them somewhat, and that has to do with the slide that you projected that had all the different organizations that were working in the coastal zone area. Is the governor's office like the clearinghouse of activities? So if someone was doing something, is there any requirement in essence that they get in contact with the governor's office or with CIPRA in regards to what they're doing in the coastal area? That'd be my first question.
No, I wouldn't say there's a clearinghouse. We obviously have a very close relationship with the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities as well as CPRA. And so from a situational awareness perspective, we want them to know what we're doing and we want them to participate with us. You know, we're trying to do something here that is a little different than what we've done in the past through the master plan and through our typical activities. And we're really trying to drill down at a community level. And instead of going to a community per se and saying, okay, here are the projects that we can project to have maximum benefit, and here's what we're going to install and implement over a period of time. We're really going to communities with a blank slate and saying, here's what we think future land loss is going to look like, future flood risk. And so in light of everything that's happening in the Coastal Master Plan, we still need to think through how we're going to change over time. And so if we do that, it's not so much using the Governor's Office as a clearinghouse. We're really trying to create something that could potentially be part of future iterations of the Coastal Master Plan.
Okay. And the second question, and it really may even be a question comment or a comment question, is that in an appreciation for what the Governor's Office is doing in this regard, is as you look at the 2067, just between the present and the 2067, there can be this just almost resignation that nothing can be done and just to walk away. But the Governor's Office is not walking away, and there's organizations that are not walking away from the reality of what could be. It's not here yet. Obviously, it's not 2067 yet. But the reality of what could be, and they're actually trying to do something in that to benefit those residents in those coastal communities and the businesses in those coastal communities in light of what that future may be. And I guess the question is how did when you show this to a community group and they look at it, what is their response as far as just what the 2067 map looks like? Is it shock?
That's right. So I mean, you know, and I always stress to my team that we have to show a very high level of tact and consideration for people that are really looking out into the future and anticipating, you know, potentially a very dire set of circumstances. And so it's got to be an extremely considerate conversation. We're very careful in how we illustrate the imagery that I just showed to you all. But it's also, we can't varnish what we think may happen in the future. Right? And so the idea is to say, we're going to come to you as a community and we're going to show you what we think this looks like over time. And we're going to collectively wrap our minds around the idea that this could be extremely detrimental to your way of life. But if we also understand that we've got 2 generations essentially to figure this out, how do we act today to facilitate a better set of outcomes than what we would anticipate if we do nothing? And I don't mean nothing from the restoration side or the protection side. I mean if we do nothing outside of those types of activities.
Right. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
But I was going to say that I think that in that regard, your slide that you had on reinventing a future of the potential projects that could, economic projects that could benefit the aquaculture area, you know, the energy sector, the ecotourism, those were very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah,
and I think that's ultimately where we're trying to go. And so it's to say, how do we take a negative and turn it into a positive to the extent that we can? And that's been a message that people have been extremely receptive to. And frankly, I mean, even as we articulate that future land loss condition, that future flood risk condition, you know, people are respectful of the fact that we're coming to them and we're not offering them a cure-all. We're not offering them some vision that we can't reasonably anticipate. We're having a real conversation, an honest conversation. And so I think, you know, so far people have been extremely respectful of the fact that we are being honest and we are trying to think through a very difficult set of circumstances with their help.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Matt, this is Charles Guignetti. the group's probably tired of hearing me say this, but I believe there's enormous opportunity to mobilize the individual landowners in the communities. Clearly, we have an immediate vested interest in how this turns out. And I don't think it would take much, just access to technology, to processes, maybe materials. There's been lots of great examples of, tax abatements or grant programs, whatever, previous disasters that have shown how the individuals can be restored and even improved. But I have like 20 mature hardwood trees that are about to fall into the body, which may seem inconsequential in the overall plan. But those trees hold the soil together, and when they're gone, it's just one more barrier gone. But, in my little oak tree, not a big difference, but if you entire stretch of body along where I live, if all the landowners were mobilized, educated, and problem areas are becoming worse. Anyway, it's just a thought. I know among my neighbors and the people that I know, there's a great will and interest to do things, but we probably need some direction and probably some resources to do it. Again, it's not like a big coastal restoration program or a levee construct program. I just think low-hanging fruit that I'd like to see put into the planning process.
So you were breaking up a little bit. I didn't hear everything that you said, but I think you're touching on a point that I make to the project team all the time, and that, in the 6-parish target area, we have roughly 1 million people. And we want to get to know as many of those people as possible, and we want to get the opportunity to really think through what the future is going to look like with as many of those people as possible. And that's how you build a coalition, right? And so if we talk about our 21 public meetings we're doing over last week and this week, we're really trying to win those rooms one at a time. And if we're able to do that, I think we can gather groups of people that may think that the contribution that they make would be inconsequential in isolation, but at scale certainly would have some more tangible benefit, right? And so if we're trying to think through a set of solutions that are going to be low-hanging fruit, efficient, cheap, part of what we're talking about here is the fact that we don't have the money as a state to do all of the coastal restoration and structural protection activities that we would like to do, okay? And that's just a dire reality. What can we do outside of those types of activities? What can we do at the individual level? How can we work to scale up what may be happening at the individual level today to be encompassing of larger groups of folks?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Hey, Matt, it's Tyler Ortego. How you doing?
How you doing, Tyler? It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been. We need to get together when your road show slows down. But I wanted to ask, what are you seeing coming out of the communities that's either it's really standing out? What are people saying that's catching your eye or differs from the official line or whatever else?
Well, I think it depends on the community. So again, being in Covington, for example, is a lot different than being in Buren. And so in those coastal environments specifically, we're talking to a lot of fishermen, a lot of oystermen, a lot of people that rely on their proximity to water. And they want to know, how do we maintain that industry? How do we think through, how we compete with the rest of the world, for example? One of the common refrains we hear from those communities are the fact that the prices of seafood have declined because the market is being inundated with foreign seafood, and that's certainly an issue for us here in Louisiana. But if we compound that problem with the idea that diversion can impact those environments and how those people are able to work within those environments, there's a lot of concern about the viability of the future of Louisiana seafood. And so, and you and I have talked about it before, Tyler. If we understand how the environment may change relative to some of those diversion projects, and where we may see, say, oyster populations proliferate more or less based on those environmental changes, how can we think through that future today, and how do we prepare the people that rely on those industries to remain viable over time? And so, there's clearly appetite to say, if we understand environmental changes, we understand how economies may change as a result. How do we either help folks preserve what they currently have, or how do we help people recalibrate into different types of workforces that may manifest themselves in the future. And so I think the economic piece of this is one that hasn't been talked about enough. I think the people that know that they're going to be impacted over time are desperate to have this conversation because they're frankly afraid. And so I think we have a real opportunity to work with those folks and develop a series of programs to not only alleviate concerns but hopefully lead to some real economic benefit.
Does that answer your question, Tyler? Let's see when I'm mute.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah, that's very good stuff. And anyone else? All right, Matt, we want to thank you for your presentation today and thank you for everything that you're doing on our behalf because you are working for us collectively. And I just wish you and your team the best of fortune as you assimilate all the information that you have been collecting and produce a plan moving forward that would meet most of the demands and desires of the populations that you're encountering. And I really appreciated your comment on how you prepare your team to go into these meetings because again, just watching, we've seen a couple of presentations so far that have indicated the dramatic changes that will be taking place, but I can say that these slides in particular were the most visually, you could really see it, let me put it to you that way, of what the really impact is. And I think that idea of a 12-foot flood on that one that you were showing, I guess for Plaquemine Parish and English Turn would be in the 12-foot flood prone area. That's pretty serious for the people that own property in English Turn. And so what you're doing has great importance. And of course, I live in Baton Rouge, and I'm not facing the flooding that they have on the coast, although we do have local flooding here. But I really, I'm going to be praying for you and your team because you really are dealing with people's emotions and their hearts and their futures. And not to say that their future is in your hands, but you will have a large influence on what that future will be for them. So again, I just thank you for your presentation today, and thank you for what you're doing.
I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have addressed e-Rotary Coastal today. I'm sorry, and I really appreciate you guys you've created this group, and it's one that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very much looking forward to being a part of.
Well, we would love to have you, and Charles, I'll send you an email, and basically just go to our website. It has an Apply Now button on our website, erotarycoastal.org, and fill that out, and we'll get you in the club.
Excellent. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Matt. Charles, you have any closing comments before we head out? If you're a visiting Rotarian with us today, go to our website, and on Matt's presentation page, slide all the way to the bottom, and they will have a spot for you to fill out a visiting that you attended the meeting. Just fill that out and email it, and you will receive an email copy of it. Bring that to your club Sergeant at Arms, and you will be recorded as attending a meeting. And with that, I just wish everyone have a fantastic day. And Charles, I'll let you close it out. Charles, you want to close us out?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. We are organizationally, we are pretty much chartered now. There'll be other activities. We know our focus has been on the presentation aspect of it, but expect to hear more from Philip shortly on some actual Rotary-centric activities, including a meetup so that we can all know each other in person. We just received an invitation from the Levy District Director in Terrebonne Parish to do what he called a windshield tour of projects, Rotarians, on a bus basically. Viewing firsthand what's going on, and I'm sure we could repeat that process. And it's still also mentioned we'll be creating a directory or a clearinghouse of groups and organizations that are engaging in coastal issues in all forms. please share the information. The club is wide open. We need as many participants at as many levels as possible. But other than that, it's a pleasure to speak to everybody today, and have a great week.
Thank you. Y'all have a great week. Bye.